can start the webinar. My name is Siziwe Ngwabe. I am the lead for Africa Evidence Network. Welcome again to the Innovations in EIDM in Capacity Development. We're going to be discussing implications for various stakeholders in Africa during this webinar. I think it is important just to make sure that all of us are able to participate fully during this webinar, just to go through a few housekeeping that will help us all in the process of running the webinar. We are going to invite all of you to participate as much as possible during this webinar. That's really important to get your views around the topic. And then secondly, we are recording the session because we want to make sure that after this webinar, we are able to share the recording with you, including the blog that will go with it, so that you can indulge with the content a bit more. And also would like to ask you to keep your cameras off just to save bandwidth for us and also slow connections for other people participating in the webinar. And also please keep your mic off for us so that we make sure that we manage the noise as we record the session and make sure that everyone can hear each other during the conversations that are going to take place. In case you're experiencing any technical problems, please write to Charity on the chat box so that you can be assisted as soon as possible. And lastly, also engage with us on the same chat box during this webinar, and then Charity will manage all the inputs that are coming to the chat box. So feel free to make sure that you chat with us via the chat box as the discussions are going forward. I hope you've got all the housekeeping rules. Just to give you a bit of background on how we got to this session today. About the manifesto, I think we drafted the manifesto in 2020 during Evidence 2020 online. That was an output that was developed by the working group of enhancing capacities. So the manifesto is a declaration by all Africans' evidence ecosystem about the kind of capacity development we practice. And also, most importantly, it is an Africa-led approach to enhancing capacities for EIDM in Africa. And also, it serves as a good resource and inspiration to the evidence ecosystem in the continent. And we challenge mainstream views on capacity development for EIDM in the continent. Please feel free to go through the current version of the manifesto. It is on the AEN website, and also the link will be attached on the chat so that you can have an opportunity to go through the manifesto. And just to take you through the session today about this webinar series, this is an Evidence 2023 Capacity webinar series. One, we want to create a platform for sharing experiences and ideas to enhance capacity for evidence use in Africa. And we want to generate ideas for the wider ecosystem strengthening efforts and improve and illustrate the AEN Manifesto on capacity development for use in Africa. So this is basically more information about this webinar series that we have started. As I've indicated, this is our second webinar. And then just zooming into the session today, our moderator will kick off the session and sort of facilitate the session to make sure that all our panelists are participating in the webinar. So the objective then of this session is to understand the implications of innovative approaches used by different practitioners for evidence-informed decision-making capacity development in Africa. So I will now also hand over to our moderator for today, which is Kirchuffs, to sort of set the scene and make initial comments that are drawn from our panelists. And please note, this is a panel discussion and the moderator will facilitate those discussions. And then he will give back to me to close the session, last 2 minutes of the session, just to close the session, to wrap all up this session. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to hand over to Kirchuffs, who is our moderator this afternoon. Over to you, Kirchuffs.
Thank you very much, Siziwe, and thank you all for making time to join our discussions this afternoon. I want to believe that it's a topic that is relevant to us all, which is why we are here. And so, not to take much time, we will move into introducing our panelists. So first on our list, we have Chris Chibwana, and Chris is a program officer in gender equity and governance at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. He manages a portfolio of grants that aim to strengthen the effectiveness of governments in Africa and improve outcomes for all people. Chris has 15 years of experience designing, managing, and evaluating development programs. He joined the foundation from the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, where he served as head of the Hub for Agricultural Policy Action, an initiative designed to help governments use data and evidence to foster the enabling environment for agriculture. Prior to that, Chris spent 4 years working to improve lives with data and evidence as a partner and the head of Africa for ID Insights based in Lusaka, Zambia. In this role, Chris was ID Insights primary regional representative and was responsible for realizing the organization's sector transforming vision for the Africa region. He also served at USAID for 7 years, including a year in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where he led the design of a large multi-sector project to improve nutrition outcomes for women and adolescent girls in the southwest region of Bangladesh. He also worked at USAID in Malawi, where he designed and oversaw projects to support evidence-informed decision-making by the Malawi government to improve results for smallholder farmers. His work as a researcher with the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, contributed to the body of knowledge that informed subsequent reforms to the Malawi government's agricultural input subsidy program, a key government policy to enhance food security. Chris has a master's degree in agricultural economics from Purdue University in Indiana and a bachelor's degree in agribusiness management from the University of Malawi. Chris, you are welcome. Next on our panel list, we have Elizabeth Aliro, and Elizabeth is the program manager at the Economic Policy Research Center in Kampala, Uganda. She possesses cross-cutting skills and experience in communications, policy engagement, monitoring evaluation, and information management. Her current focus is on strengthening evidence-informed decision-making in policy processes in Uganda. Specifically, Elizabeth is involved in designing a training and mentorship program to enhance the capacity of selected ministries, departments, and agencies, local governments, and civil society to produce and use gender statistics to deliver Uganda's gender equality and women's empowerment commitments. Previously, Elizabeth was involved in undertaking evidence use diagnostics, namely a political economy analysis of evidence use in Uganda and a diagnostic that examined the key factors affecting evidence use in planning, monitoring, evaluation, and budgeting on the Development Plan Implementation Program, one of the 20 priority programs under the country's third National Development Plan, that's NDP 3. Her personal social, okay. Next on our lists, we have Mohammed Awal. Mohammed is a senior research analyst at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, CDD Ghana, a research and policy think tank that combines evidence-based research, citizen engagement interventions, and accountability and transparency initiatives to support the deepening of democracy and governance for inclusive development outcomes in Ghana and across Africa. Mohammed currently leads CDD Ghana's Evidence for Development Project, which aims to strengthen the capacity and incentives of local policy bureaucrats to use data and evidence in policy planning and program implementation in selected local government authorities across Ghana, a project funded by Hewlett Foundation. And last but not the least, we have Roberta Blankson, who is a senior program officer at the International Center for Evaluation and Development, ICED, where she plays lead roles in high-level strategic engagements and partnerships. She's well-versed in supporting the work of several government entities and parliaments, international donors and partners, civil society organizations, and communities of practice by designing and delivering policy programs, projects, monitoring and evaluation, capacity strengthening interventions, and collaborations that enhance evidence-based decision-making and development effectiveness. She is the co-designer of the Parliamentary Knowledge Exchange Forum, which provides platforms for CSOs to collaborate with African parliaments on utilizing robust evidence for policymaking and accelerating an evaluation culture, and also plays lead roles in organizing the annual International Evidence to Action Conference. She has collaborated on projects with institutions such as CLARE AA, Twende Mbele, Afria, Campbell Collaborations, ID Insights, the World Bank, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and UNICEF, among others. The International Center for Evaluation and Development fills an important gap in the global evaluation architecture. It is one of the first African-based and Africa-led international think tanks that combines research and innovation with extensive practical experience in evaluation for development in Africa. I will at this point welcome all our panelists, and as indicated by our chair, you are all welcome to participate in this discussion by sending your contributions in terms of questions and comments into the chat box, and we will take those into considerations at some point during our discussions. Thank you all for making time again, panelists. And I will want to proceed, yes, with the model. This model first will frame the conversation that we will be having. So typical of an evidence, EIDM evidence ecosystem, we have these different stakeholders interacting to get work done. So amongst those, we have producers, intermediaries, and then users. So previously, in the previous webinar, there were discussions of the different innovations that are taking shape across the continent. And panelists and yourself, the audience, you may have come across some innovative works on the region. So to this current webinar, today's discussion is to look at the implications of these innovations for the different stakeholders. As you can see from this model that is displayed, we have different producers of evidence, the different users as well as, and then the intermediary organizations who are playing very, very, very important roles in getting the ecosystem to function well. So our discussion will basically be to explore implications for these different actors, considering the innovations that are taking place for EIDM capacity development. And so my first question to our panelists, for them to share their initial thoughts, would be to see whether their organizations are playing some roles as highlighted in this model within the ecosystem, and what are some specific roles that their organizations are playing, and yeah, if there are any other roles that they envisage for this model, they can highlight that as well. So I will take a quick round through our audience, our panelists, and so let me begin with Elizabeth. You may want to share your initial thoughts on that, whether, I mean, what role your organization, you see your organization playing within the ecosystem, and yeah, if there are any other roles that you envisage. Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you are muted. You may want to unmute. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Hello?
can hear you, Elizabeth.
Oh. Thank you so much. As a think tank, the primary role we play within the evidence ecosystem is we serve as producers of evidence, and the evidence we generate is mainly aimed at informing decision makers. And what we do is we provide evidence-based research that is responsive not only to policy, but also other development needs of the different stakeholders within the ecosystem. And we do this through three main strands. One is the generation of the evidence, the knowledge itself, and the various knowledge products. We also offer technical and advisory support, and this is done specifically with government agencies, but also sometimes with development partners. And then we also do capacity building in research, undertaking research, but also capacity building of our stakeholders to be able to increase evidence uptake. But other than being producers, we also are involved in the evidence ecosystem as intermediaries, where we are involved in knowledge brokerage and translation. And we mainly rely on data that is generated through the national statistical system. We are involved in analyzing it and interpreting it to be able to answer policy questions and also make recommendations. So we do serve those two roles. We serve as producers, and we also serve as intermediaries within the evidence ecosystem. But as the two are closely intertwined, sometimes we also find ourselves, the three rather, serving as users of evidence. But I would say we are predominantly producers and intermediaries. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Elizabeth. And yeah, rightly so, the different roles are interconnected in some way or the other. So that's very much acknowledged. I'll come to you, Mohammed. You may want to take your turn next shortly. You will want to tell us what roles within the ecosystem your organization plays.
Thank you very much. Greetings to all participants and my co-panelists. I think that, as Rose said, Elizabeth and yourself acknowledged, I think the three structure in terms of the both the producers, the intermediaries, and then the users, you would find my organization running around all of that. At one time, we produce evidence because we are set up as a research think tank. And so we generate a lot of evidence through a number of ways and strategies that we've adopted. Particularly if you look at our work with Afrobarometer, which we are a founding organization, and we lead a number of citizen-generated data where we produce a number of opinion data around so many issues to gain citizens' perspective to inform policy action. We also conduct some evaluations of major government policy programs and projects to try and feedback that into the policy processes and all of that. On the intermediary side, you would find us also playing a number of roles, both as advocates to strengthen the ecosystem and to build systems that can strengthen both the generation and its use. And here you would find us working with other actors, whether they are state agencies or non-state actors, to sort of understand the challenges in the ecosystem and to advocate for some kind of reforms to strengthen that. And you see us working with, say, the Ghana Statistical Service to develop standards, data quality assurance standards and then how we can bring other data sources into the policy conversation, into the evidence ecosystem for use. Additionally, in terms of intermediaries, you would find that we also build capacity on evidence use, whether it's for government actors or civil society or for citizens, in terms of how either the evidence that we produced is used, or the evidence that is produced by the state and other actors is used either by policymakers or by citizens for advocacy purposes, or by policymakers to inform policy decisions, and so on and so forth. And then also as users, obviously, you would find us also using a lot of government data. The state generates so much data. We use some of the data, we model some of the data, and we create information products that we provide for citizens to use for their advocacy purposes. And so as CDD, we play all the roles within the ecosystem as it's structured.
All right, thank you very much, Mohammed, for that. I will come to you, Chris. You will take your turn, and then Roberta will finish this first round for us. Chris.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kirchuffs. Yeah, hello, colleagues and everybody who's joined. Really excited to be a part of this conversation. So Hewlett is within the ecosystem. And I guess maybe just to introduce the foundation. So I work for the Hewlett Foundation, as Kirchuffs mentioned. We're a private foundation based out of Menlo Park in California. We mostly, the work that we do that's related to this is to fund the work of either producers or intermediaries that are working to promote evidence use. So our current strategy, which actually is called the evidence-informed policy-making strategy, is premised on, I'd say, two outcomes that are related to this conversation. One is that we would like to see African policy research institutions working with governments to make regular use of evidence sort of the norm, but doing that by building government capacity, bring together scholars as well as policymakers to ensure that research that's being done is relevant for decision making, but also fostering national and regional communities of practice focused on evidence-informed decision making. So the work of the AEN, for instance, comes to mind in terms of building communities of practice. I think the second outcome that's related to this is we would like to support the strengthening of think tanks and to promote African expertise, bring that African expertise, elevate African scholars and institutions so they're respected and can actively participate in policy discussions within their countries, but also globally. And so as you can see, capacity building runs through across the entirety of our current strategy, which I'll add that we're currently in the process of updating to come up with a new strategy. But under the current strategy, we've basically supported capacity building over the past 5 years. We've supported a collection of global as well as regional and African think tanks that are working to promote the use of data and evidence for decision making. And I think the field, the ecosystem has come a long way from, I would say, 5-10 years ago. We now have a field of strong actors where we didn't have before. And I'm not attributing that growth to the efforts of the Hewlett Foundation. I think we've contributed to it. I think it's thanks mostly to the organizations themselves who do this hard work of either producing or intermediating evidence. And I think over the past 3 years, doing that within a really, really challenging environment. But I just mentioned, I think, why we believe that investing in capacity building matters. I know it's not always, capacity building is not always the most attractive intervention by funders, but we think it matters because, I mean, the hypothesis that we ran on is that we need capacity at all levels of that ecosystem that Kirchuffs shared at the beginning to drive evidence use. There's no use working on one level of the ecosystem when the other levels aren't working without addressing capacity challenges at those other levels. Because it doesn't matter, for instance, how rigorous your evidence is, if the end user doesn't understand it, if the end user doesn't trust it, if the end user doesn't have the capacity or the ability to be able to apply it. If your evidence is great, as rigorous as possible, you're not going anywhere with it. And so whether it's capacity for evidence generators, capacity for intermediaries to conduct, let's say, systematic reviews or to conduct evidence synthesis, or the ability to demand, to interpret, to apply evidence by a policymaker, we believe that a holistic approach to capacity building is needed if we're to see the sort of changes that we all hope to see in the evidence-informed decision-making ecosystem. That said, I'll conclude by citing, I think, 2 reasons, as I mentioned, why capacity building may not be attractive. And I think I'm hoping to get to this later in the conversation. I think one of the reasons why for a donor, for a funder, capacity building may not be attractive is just fatigue. I mean, donors and funding organizations may experience fatigue or reduced enthusiasm for supporting capacity building interventions if they perceive that there's been limited progress or there's been limited impact from previous investments. If the results of previous investments are not seen as successful or as sustainable, it can lead to a decline in funding commitments towards capacity building. That's one. And I think the second reason why capacity building is not often seen as attractive by funders is that the lack of demonstrated results. And it's ironic because we all talk about evidence-informed decision-making. And capacity building interventions often focus on strengthening the skills, the knowledge, the attitudes, the resources of individuals, organizations, or communities. But you agree with me that demonstrating the direct impact or the tangible outcomes of capacity building can be challenging. It can be very difficult, especially in the short term. And a lot of grant funding cycles are very short term. It can be very difficult to demonstrate change within 2 years, within 5 years. And so if there's insufficient evidence to show the effectiveness and value of these interventions, it may lead to decreased funding support. I think we've seen that happen across the board, but I'm hoping that it's something that we can begin to address as a field going forward. I will pause there and hand over back to the chair.
All right, thank you very much. And I agree with you, Chris, when you mentioned that there's a high risk of fatigue within this space. So it's a reason we all need to innovate. Roberta, you will take your turn for this first round of questions. Thank you. You're muted, Roberta.
I hope this is better.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, great. So I'm with the International Center for Evaluation and Development, and we are an international nonprofit think tank that particularly supports innovation strategy and evaluation for development in Africa and in the global south. And when it comes to where we find ourselves within this ecosystem, we do find ourselves as producers and also as intermediaries. Particularly when it comes to generating evidence, synthesizing it, and playing that role of an intermediary and supporting the users to be able to, use the evidence for decision making, whether it's through things like, EGMs or systematic reviews or undertaking evaluations of interventions that have, been implemented over some time. And we do find ourselves often working, whether it's with researchers or it's with funders, to enable them have insights into some of the work they're doing in different countries and different contexts, and being able to facilitate conversations through different, say, forums or conferences, convenings, and platforms that enable shared learning and understanding of the different means by which, evidence garnered can be utilized. And so I think as we go forward, we would find that these areas, when it comes to whether you're a producer or whether you are an intermediary or a user, they're very interconnected and interwoven. And we do find ourselves within that space where we are either producing or we are supporting as intermediaries, or we are facilitating utilization amongst different organizations. So we work a lot with communities of practice or with different parliaments and governments to enable them be able to utilize or translate the findings of research or evidence into actionable, strategies and plans that could be implemented within different unique, areas or within different unique context of development.
All right, thank you very much for those introductory remarks. And we noticed that from your submissions, yourself, your organizations, as well as the partners you're working with, all try to innovate in one way or the other. So I will move to the next question then, which is what you see as implications of these different innovative approaches being used within the ecosystem for capacity development. What are some implications of these approaches to actors like your organization? What are some implications of these innovations to your organization? How do they impact on your organization and the work you do? Let me start from you, Roberta. As you just finished, let me come back to you to begin this round first. Roberta.
Right. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Great. So I think for us, one of the implications is being able to see that there is increased interest when it comes to, utilizing evidence for different interventions, using evidence for policy making. And I wouldn't want to go too deep, but I think one of the things, as we said, working on is the Parliamentary Knowledge Exchange Forum that, creates collaborations between CSOs and parliaments. And for us, it's being able to see the interest grow over time and being able to institutionalize when it comes to utilizing evidence, M&E practices within different ministries, government agencies, and seeing the increase of the interest and being able to demand, okay, so where is the evidence that would support a decision or an action such as this, and being able to translate that into workable plans going forward. And another thing that I think is important to note is being able to facilitate and support that we see a lot when it comes to researchers, being able to have African researchers lead their own research processes, have locally led research in their own context. And I remember there's something that we're doing called the All In program. And within this, it gives the opportunity for African researchers to lead within their local context what is important. So in that way, it's not just giving them the opportunity to say that maybe through a training. It's not a training, but it's providing them with grants. It's a $6 million grant from USAID through our organization to work with these African researchers, enable them to be able to lead, because usually we find that although it says Global South, it's usually having a heavy influence from the Global North, and being able to have African researchers lead their entire process, go right from the concept design to the end result, and being able to lead that process, we find it as a great and innovative capacity building mechanism for us. And being able to, have the different parties and different say it may not necessarily even be, we found this particularly even when it comes to even grant management and being able to build within institutions. There was one institution that didn't necessarily have that experience or capacity to handle such a large grant, but working with them, we know that now that they have the capacity to do that, and so it becomes easier for them to bid on their own and have such opportunities, and then greater opportunities to create evidence and utilize it. And also we find the opportunities to improve awareness and demand, also looking at advancing learning, because it's very important. It's not just about, having evidence, but being able to utilize it and to be able to learn from that process, what worked, what didn't work well, how are you able to improve going further, and also facilitating the collaborations that, enable to scale up. So rather than duplicating efforts, how are you able to scale up through shared learning? How are you able to facilitate collaborations across the different partners in the ecosystem, whether it is producers or intermediaries or users? How are you able to create common platforms that enable them to be able to work together for a higher impact? So those are some of the things that we found are the implications for being able to facilitate evidence-informed decision-making in the long term. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Roberta, for that. Obviously, there are implications for us as practitioners. I will come to you, Mohammed, as a research producing organization, seeing the innovations that are happening within the ecosystem from the user's perspective, from fellow intermediary organizations, from other producers. And what's the implication? What's the impacts that these are having on your organization? Real impacts or potential impacts? How do these come to your organization, Mohammed?
Thank you very much, Kirchuff. I think that I share in a lot of what Roberta has said, but only to add that in our case, I think there's a lot more work that we are seeing in terms of the impact around some of these innovations at the subnational level, at the district level, right? And one of the things that we are most interested in, this is where the lives of the people matters, really. And that to build the kinds of bureaucratic capacity and structures and systems that are most responsive to everyday citizens' need is most important. And so for us, where we want to see more of the implications or what we are trying to see change is through these innovations is to see that, yes, our local government, our local authorities are structured in such a way that they are able to respond to citizens' need. They are able to respond to citizens' feedback as well, and how they model that in the kinds of decisions that they make. And another level of implication that is important to us is around dialogue, relationship, and collaboration between both producers, particularly in this case, civil society, citizen groups, and all of that at that subnational level, with local government authorities. I think in many contexts, you would see that the relationship and the dialogue that ensue from there is not structured, focusing on the most important development issues that face citizens and the challenges of generating the kinds of data that is most useful for policy making. And so we are interested in seeing how these kinds of innovations are changing these kinds of patterns, these kinds of outcomes for us. That in setting the research agenda, is there a process for co-creating the evidence that is most responsive to a localized context? And what kinds of capacities that are needed to be built, either for civil society actors to work with local government authorities, policy actors in the bureaucracies at the local level, to be able to generate those kinds of evidence that are most useful to address policy questions. And added to that, really, is then the question about how do we build up a field of practice at that subnational level. I think that a lot of the organizations and the work that is done, if you understand the local government context or the subnational level context, is that most of these organizations are just service delivery agencies. What they do is to support government in terms of uptake of government services, and to a lesser degree, they do a number of advocacy work as well. And so just creating the awareness, creating the interest, and incentivizing some kind of attention and building capacity and interest in this issue as an added portfolio of work to focus on, which has implications on governance, on the quality of governance and the development outcomes that we seek. We thought is one other implications that some of these innovations that we are piloting should seek to focus a lot more attention on. And obviously, in the end, it is to see an institutional process of evidence use, that in everyday policy debate, policy conversation, evidence is most central. That what is informing our actions, whether it's bureaucrats, whether it is development organizations or civil groups or associations, our programming are informed by evidence, and that we have a process of reviewing, evaluating, and understanding how our programming are impacting our communities and what that means for the quality of governance and then development outcomes. And so for us, there are all of these implications that we want to see in terms of the innovations and how they address, particularly at the subnational level, where in many countries, in many contexts, governance is very constrained, whether in terms of structurally by policy framework or in terms of physical relationship between the state and the local state and then the central state and all of that, and how in between that we mediate citizens' voice, citizens' access in the policy-making processes and all of that. So there are certainly a number of implications for us that we hope that through these interventions, the innovations around capacity development, not only focusing on training, but creating opportunities for continuous dialogue, for building relationships that are most central to how systems work, whether in the individual civil society organizations, our partners that we work with, but also most importantly in the local state and the way the bureaucracy is structured to deal with the everyday development challenges that communities are facing.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammed, for bringing those perspectives out also. I will come to you next, Elizabeth, and then I will finish this round with Christopher. So, Elizabeth, you may want to have your take on implications of these innovations happening for your organization and the work that you do. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much once again. For us as a think tank, I think our first implication really is to try to understand through a systematic process, to understand the intentions, the processes, and the expected impact from all these various interventions. And this will involve having to understand the context in which these interventions are being done. Are they being implemented in a manner that they can be scaled up to other contexts? Are there commonalities that we can from these innovations? And looking at the innovations that were discussed in the previous webinar, you realize that most of these focus on building capacity in the areas of the hard or the technical capacities, and are very quiet on the soft capacities. Those are the invisible ones, the ones that involve motivations, the ones that involve cultures that impact the way evidence is being used. So for us, we would like to see how best then can we get a deeper understanding so that we ensure that the interventions that are being implemented relate to the soft skills that have been identified, or the soft capacities that have been identified as a major hindrance to evidence use, particularly in the Africa region. As I think earlier indicated, that most of these interventions are also externally driven. So are there any interventions that are homegrown and Africa-led? Because looking at the manifesto of the African Evidence Network, the intention is really to increase interventions that are capacity development interventions that are African-led. So we would like to also know. So really ours is to try to unearth, to understand more what these interventions are all about. Because right now, it's like they're all small, different interventions scattered, and it's very difficult to come up with a broad picture of the kinds of lessons that we are learning from these interventions, the kind of best practices that we are learning from an African perspective. So that is one thing we'd really like to venture or to interface with. Then the second one is around us learning also from those interventions and being able to adopt and replicate them to our context as a country, but also as a center, given that we are involved in also designing other capacity development interventions, like the one we are currently working on, to develop capacity of data users and producers in the area of gender statistics. So we would like to draw lessons and experiences from those various interventions to use them to design our own interventions. The other concern that we have, or area where implication we have, is the need. This has been reiterated or said by other colleagues who spoke before me, the need to see how do we synthesize the evidence that is coming out of all these innovations to make sure that we can be able to share it in a manner that will allow and facilitate further evidence use in the Africa region. So those are really some of the implications that we are looking at, and also how we expect to interface with the interventions highlighted in the previous webinar. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those. Chris, you have your opportunity. Share with us what implications there are for funders like your organization.
Yeah, so but I like this conversation and I agree with a lot of what has been said. I think it's exciting for me as a funder of this work to see us talking about innovating sort of homegrown solutions, homegrown approaches to building capacity. I think we believe that to be effective and to be sustainable, that promoting evidence use needs to be done by those that are closer to the people, the decision makers that we're hoping to influence. So what we call proximate actors. So I think seeing this conversation happening tells me that we're going in the right direction. Because as you know, in the early stages of EIDM, the field was mostly dominated by global northern organizations, right? But that has changed. The fact that we have all these organizations that are in this webinar, that are in the participants list is a great sign that we're moving in the right direction. And so as a foundation, we're committed to funding African producers and intermediaries, and to see this level of innovation is super exciting. Now, I'll mention that I think innovation is great and it's exciting that it's happening, we're innovating, but let's make sure that the efforts to build capacity, and I think this goes back to my earlier point, that these efforts actually work. And if we don't know that these efforts work, let's generate the evidence that tells us that these efforts are actually effective or are worth implementing or not. Because unlike other fields, our evidence ecosystem is not that well funded, right? And so that calls for efficiencies in how we deploy the limited resources that we have. As a fund, I'm always interested in identifying not only what are the innovations, but also what are, for lack of a better term, the best buys when it comes to capacity building of the different actors. You see, I come from an agricultural background. I've worked with smallholder farmers a lot. And when you're trying to convince a smallholder farmer to adopt something, there's what you call the gross margin, which is, this is how much it's going to cost you, but this is the return. And farmers will go for, because they're rational individuals, they'll go for what brings in the most return. So what's the gross margin, as it were? And I understand that in this case, our profit is not monetary profit, it's social impact. It's the changes that we hope to see. So what's the gross margin on these approaches that we're looking to promote? What's that return on investment? Because if I have 3 organizations that are proposing to build capacity and they're using different approaches, like how do I select between 1 or 2 or 2 or 3 or 1 or 3? So beginning to generate that evidence ourselves, I think is the right thing. Because then it will be ironic if, as actors within the evidence-informed ecosystem, we're asking governments to make evidence-informed policies, to implement evidence-informed interventions, but we ourselves are not actually implementing evidence-informed interventions. We're just like trying things and not caring about whether they actually work. So I think as a field, we should introspect and think about the many approaches we use, whether it's just not just capacity building, for all other things. Do they actually work? Where's the evidence that says, if I do this, it's going to lead to this outcome? I think leading by example like that would be super interesting. Now, I think it's also important for us to right size the capacity problem. And I think this touches on the issue around why is there donor fatigue? A lot of, I think, capacity building programs feel so big. What do we mean by capacity building within the context of EIDM? For the different types of stakeholders that we have in the ecosystem, what does increased capacity begin to look like? I don't expect that we'll train, for instance, a policymaker to be able to design and implement an RCT, something that requires years of specialized training. But I do expect that we can help them to understand the value of RCTs or the value of evidence more broadly. We can help them to know when the evidence that's presented to them is good or not good, and how to use that evidence for their decisions. I think that is capacity. So if a problem is right-sized like that, it becomes very tangible. It's easier for a funder to see how that is useful and how that's feasible, how that's possible, and how that can be supported. And then I think the final point for me is there's the question on how to move beyond building the capacity of the individual, which I think for a lot of us, that's fairly easy to do. We can organize training workshops, seminars, webinars like this to build the capacity of individuals. But building the capacity of institutions, I think, is harder. But it's so important so that our efforts can stick for the sustainability of our work. Because see, what happens is when you capacitate one individual of an organization, that person becomes very good at their job. That they become more attractive to the local World Bank office, the local USAID office, and sooner or later they leave their job. We have to start all over again. So it becomes this endless cycle of just training people. They leave their job, we find somebody else, and it interrupts the flow of our interventions, the flow of our support to decision makers. So when I'm looking at how to invest in capacity building as a funder, I'm thinking, yes, about the individual, but more importantly, I'm also thinking about how to build lasting institutional capacity. And efforts like the Africa Evidence Network are great. They've created this movement of 4,000 plus individuals across Africa, building their capacity, getting them excited about using evidence. But where is the AEN for organizations? What are the platforms that are allowing organizations to collaborate, to build capacity? I think Roberta raised a very good point. We need collaboration, more collaboration within our field. Where is that AEN for institutions?
All right. Thank you very much, Chris, for those thought-provoking questions. And obviously, we will need more such institutions for, for organizations beyond the individual level. So thank you, panelists, for these views. At this point, I will give opportunity to our audience. There have been some questions coming through, so I'll quickly pass through them and then get your responses or perspectives as panelists quickly. So let me start with Nolutando. He appreciates Chris, your emphasis on the importance of the end user, and asks what are the challenges around demonstrating impact. So beyond Chris, if anybody would want to share some additional views on that as well. What are the challenges around demonstrating impact? How difficult it is? Is it, maybe I should start from you, Roberta, on this from an M&E perspective. Roberta. Roberta, are you there?
Just a minute. Yeah. So I think when it comes to being able to demonstrate the impact, some of the challenges are, yes, as we said, time. It takes time for some of the interventions that you undertake to actually be able to reach to full maturity, to be able to demonstrate those impacts. And sometimes you find yourself working within constraints. There are settings where there are already certain geopolitical constraints that do not enable you to be able to maximize, for instance, if you have a full recommendation of what needs to be done, and to be able to contextualize what works within different settings. And I find that very often those are some of the things that do not enable you to have the full scope of impact required.
All right, thank you for those views, Roberta. Chris, from your perspective as a funding organization, what are some challenges that you have seen, kind of your grantees' reports for demonstrating impact? Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think Roberta raised a good point. So like project cycles are very short, right? I mean, if you're lucky, it's going to be 5 years. In most cases, it's like 2 years. In some cases, even a year. And so within that short time frame, how do you demonstrate results that a funder, and most funders are very impatient, can see and count? Capacity building takes time. Building relationships takes time. I think as you all know, who are doing this hard work of building relationships with decision makers. So that's just one. And I think that the second is just the scale of the problem. It's easier to, I think I gave the example of like right sizing the capacity issue for a policymaker, but you're not going to have them begin to design randomized control trials, but you can certainly get them excited about using data. You can measure instances where they've demanded data and evidence. So a lot of having capacity building initiatives are not right sized, they're not right scaled, which just makes it very difficult to be able to measure whether you've actually made any progress at all. So I think identifying what you can reasonably change, what you can reasonably influence in terms of capacities is valuable. But then also, I think as a field of funders, we just need to be more patient and acknowledge that building the capacity of stakeholders within the EIDM ecosystem takes time. It takes resources, it takes money, and it's I think the right thing to do, because we're trying to address the underlying issues that stop the use of data and evidence. So it's needed, it needs to be done, but we just need to be able to have the patience to wait for the results, the right results. And I think it's also just not, sometimes it's harder to measure capacity directly. So you have to look at proximate ways to ascertain whether actually there's increased capacity within, either with an individual or across an organization.
Well, those are interesting thoughts in there. Right sizing, right scaling. Mohammed and And Elizabeth, I will come to you. So Mohammed, there's a question here asking, is there a relationship between those who set the research agenda and funding for the research project? This is coming from Ismaila Salau. Is there a relationship between those who set the research agenda and those funding and funding for the research project? Is there a relationship there? You're muted, Mohammed.
Yes, sorry about that. I think there should be as a matter of course that there is some kind of alignment about those who are funding research and those who are actually producing the research or setting the agenda, so that from that alignment of interest, I think the outcomes that we seek are quite clearly defined. But in the absence of that kind of a relationship of dialogue, openness, transparency, then it creates a number of things, and that's why I think earlier Chris was talking about the kinds of localized knowledge capacity building and all of that. That in the past this field used to be dominated by northern organizations, and there's questions about decolonizing knowledge and all of that. And so I think that to be able to do that in the most effective way, there has to be that kind of relationship that clearly defines the boundaries of what we all seek to do, and then the outcomes that we seek. I wanted to sort of pick up on something that Chris said, which for me is very, very important, the question about right sizing, because it has implications on being able to measure impact. For example, in our case, for instance, where one of the things we're trying to do with our local government is just to right size the areas where we want to influence and where we can be able to see whether our interventions have been able to influence the outcomes, particularly in policy development processes. At the local level, every 4 years, the local government develops its own 4-year development policy plan. A lot of the times, evaluations by the National Development Planning Commission suggest that some of the plans are not prepared properly. The projections, the analysis are not sound, they are not informative enough. And so one of the things we have to do around our own capacity building intervention is to right size our intervention around that, and to see that you have a baseline of a plan that in the past was not good enough. And so if you try to address the capacity challenges in the development of the plan, how does the subsequent plans begin to look like? And so I think right sizing is important, even though we understand that measuring impact in the kind of work that we do is long-term. There are a number of constraining factors. At best, you are contributing to an outcome because there are a number of factors that other ecosystem actors are doing. But I think that the idea of right-sizing our interventions and focusing on targeted specific areas where it will be easier for you to see what kinds of changes there are, and also to put in place a mechanism to understand how sustainable your intervention has been, so that it's not a one-off thing. And that goes on to about building individual capacities or focus on organizational capacity. And I think it's important that you focus on organizational capacity because there are always movements at the local level with bureaucrats. They move here and there, they are transferred here and there. And so if you focus a lot more on building individual capacities, once they move, you get back to the same problem. And so right sizing, focusing on institutions, organizational capacity building, less on individuals, I think is most important, and it provides us some kind of a framework to be able to measure in a very small way the impact of our interventions.
Yeah, thank you very much for those, Mohammed. I will come to you, Elizabeth, and there's an interest here from Melissa. She's asking, in your experience, are traditional users of research evidence becoming more involved in research production, such as through co-production, for instance, setting the research agenda, participating in the research process? Do you think traditional users of research evidence are becoming more involved in the process? Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you are muted. Sorry.
I do agree with the comment that traditional users of evidence are now getting heavily involved in the production processes of evidence. And this is because there is adoption of co-creation. And with co-creation, there is no way you will generate your research agenda without having to consult and get input from the intended users of the evidence that you're generating. The same applies to capacity development. There is no way you will sit and predefine the kind of capacity intervention that you intend to implement without having consulted or conducted a needs assessment, a capacity needs assessment, to understand the actual capacities that are required. So within the co-creation environment, we are seeing a narrowing of the boundaries between producers and users. But we are also seeing strengthening of relationships, because there is no way you can build capacity nor do research without building relationships around the ecosystem, the evidence ecosystem. So yes, through those processes, we are seeing more relationships, better relationships being built between the traditional users of evidence and with the producers. And we are seeing this as a positive thing, because then if they're involved in setting the research agenda, they will have interest in what the outcomes are. Therefore, it is likely they will increase uptake of the evidence that has been generated through such a research process. So this is something that I believe should be emphasized more to ensure that we increase uptake of evidence, but at the same time also uptake of capacity building interventions.
All right, thank you very much for those acknowledging how traditional users are getting involved in this process. As we're running against time now, let me just take one more question, but just to highlight that the questions will be followed up on later. So just one more question for you, Chris. Quickly, I think Emily wants to know here if there are any examples you can share of institutional capacity development approaches you find exciting or innovative, as some of these things, I think you alluded to that earlier. And so if there are a few of them you can highlight, then it's part of the the lesson sharing opportunities, so that we can build our knowledge around some of these. So quickly to you, Chris, as we wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So I think wearing sort of my funder blinders on, I think about the sorts of, what capacities that a funder brings to like building the capacity of institutions, and within the context of the Hewlett Foundation. Obviously, one is the money, so we can provide the funding. We've provided the funding to a lot of organizations in Africa, and I think why that's important is we want to give organizations the agency to determine what capacities they need. So it's not so much up to us to say you need capacity in ABC, but for them to actually then be able to go out and source that capacity, whether it's bringing new people, new staff, bring in a consultant to do X, Y, and Z for them. I think that always, I mean, money doesn't always solve the problem, but I think we think it actually goes a long way in being able to allow organizations to determine and set the agenda for themselves in terms of the vision and what they want to be. So that's one thing that we bring. I think the other thing is sort of sitting from where I sit, having a bird's eye view of the entire landscape. It's being able then to offer connections to people that are doing either similar work or relevant work or interesting work that's connected to the work of the grantees that I work with. Because that also then, I think I spoke about the sector being siloed. Our sector is very siloed. Like, you have people that are doing specific things, only talking to each other and not talking to everybody else. You have the sort of the methodological purists who think RCTs are the only way to go and like nothing else matters. Or the health people who only talk about demography and like specific things. But if we're able to come together and share lessons, share experiences, I think as we do in the AEN, but as organizations, I think that actually goes a long way in fostering capacity building. So part of my job is to connect those dots, connect organizations that are doing interesting work, connect organizations to other sources of funding so that they can further enhance their work. I think that's very important. And then the final thing is just raising the profile of organizations, in particular proximate actors, African organizations within global circles, whether it's through convenings or whether it's just highlighting the successful work that they're doing. That also actually goes a long way in building the profile and the capacities of those organizations. But I know I said that I want best buys. There aren't that many magic bullets, but I think we can begin to address some of these things by generating the data and evidence that I think is helpful.
All right, thank you very much, Chris, for nicely evading mentioning specific names, but equally, yeah, we get the insights from those. And so as we wrap up, I would want to go around again quickly for your reflection of these implications that we have highlighted for a useful tool like the AEN's Manifesto that we've been working with since 2020. How would you suggest the manifesto to be used in transforming? First, what's what direction do you want or would you suggest the manifesto to take in terms of we revising it? And then how do you suggest that the manifesto can be used in kind of embracing these innovations that are happening? So just 30 seconds, 1 minute reflections by you all. So let me start with you, Mohammed, quickly.
Yes. For me, I think that there's still opportunity for the questions around localization and how we strengthen that across the continent and within our own in-country, what national organizations such as us do for subnational level actors. There is a question about measuring impact. How do we measure the impact of our work and how do we learn from that to inform our own programmatic interventions? I think for me, these are two important issues that are critical to building the field and the ecosystem around evidence use and practice.
Thank you very much for that quick intervention, Mohammed. Elizabeth, let me come to you. And then I'll finish with Chris. Elizabeth. You're muted, please. Sorry.
One is we are talking about innovations in capacity development. I think we need to have, moving forward, clear parameters when we talk about innovations. What are these parameters that define innovations? Is it nuance? Is it creating an enabling environment? What is it exactly that defines innovations in capacity development? Then two, we are still witnessing gaps in understanding what strategies work, especially in the context of localization. So I think we need to focus more efforts there in trying to document, capture, synthesize, and at least come up with kind of indication of what strategies and interventions work within the African context. And inclusivity is key, and equity, especially inclusivity of persons with disabilities. Just recently, we had an experience where we're conducting a session, but we did not cater for visually impaired or hearing impaired persons with disabilities. And then when we sent out invitations, they were among those who were coming to participate. And then they told us we need 2 additional people, aides, if we are to participate. We did not have the budget for that. We had not planned for the space for that. So I think moving forward, it's very important that we, when designing capacity development interventions, we need to take into consideration issues of inclusivity, especially of the disabled persons. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Chris, 30 seconds, 1 minute on that one, and then I'll come to you, Roberta.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with the point. So let's not be like the preacher who tells people or followers that this is the way to go, but actually he goes the other direction. And so let's begin to have a conversation around the evidence behind all of these things. How evidence informed our own program. So if you think about the manifesto, for instance, can we begin to have a conversation around the evidence around the effectiveness of the many approaches that are being proposed that actors are doing, and can we share that evidence broadly so everybody knows what they're buying, basically, if they decide to go with a particular approach over another approach, because we all make these decisions, right, to do X and not do Y. And each of those has costs, but then what are the returns? What's the social impact that we hope to get from the many interventions that we implement? So let's walk the talk.
That's surely a way to go. We need to demonstrate change. Roberta.
Okay, so I think that there is the need for us to look at knowledge management and being able to clearly outline how we can transfer knowledge, we can share knowledge, and we can also create repositories of things that have worked, even the things that haven't worked, so that we can know what not to do and what to actually do and place an emphasis on. And I'd also, talk about being able to share learning, being able to improve collaborations across different organizations, and the work that we do, especially in areas where we find synergies or we find that we have common shared goals. How can we be able to, work together to scale up rather than duplicate? So these are some of the things that I want to really share on that. How are we able to enhance knowledge management? How are we able to improve collaboration and shared learning in a way that facilitates evidence-informed decision-making? Thank you.
And helping us understand some of the implications for these different innovations happening around the continent. The conversation certainly doesn't end here. There will be a LinkedIn post, and then we will continue these discussions. As there are many more questions coming up, we will continue the conversations over there. But at this point, I will hand over to our session chair, Sidziwe, to wrap up for us. Thank you all once again. Sidziwe, you have the space now.
Thank you so much, Kirchuffs, for the facilitation of the session. I think just to close, the recording for the webinar and the blog of this webinar will be published just to ensure that we continue engagements on this topic, because I saw a lot of questions on the chat. We didn't get an opportunity to get to them. So it will be great to bring those conversations on the LinkedIn platform for the AEN and continue those interesting conversations. And then also would like to share with you that please join us again on the 28th of June when we have our next session on capacity development for EIDM, innovations in targeting structural and value issues within the ecosystem. So the series continues. So this is our third webinar that will be coming in June as well. And then lastly, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our moderator and all the panelists that participated in this discussion, and also all the participants that really join in the conversation, and they're going to continue with this conversations with us. And we're also looking forward to seeing everyone at Evidence 2023. Please register for online Evidence 2023 and look out for registration for the in-person event. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you and bye.
Thank you.